To celebrate the fabulous Terry Repak and her book, Circling Home. We are so excited to also have Misha with us as a conversation partner and to spend this evening in conversation and enjoy each other's company on this lovely September night. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and acknowledge that we here at University Bookstore gather as guests on the unceded traditional lands of the Duwamish people who have lived in and been caretakers of the land here since time immemorial. We thank the people of the Coast Salish tribes for their stewardship, and we strive to nurture our relationships with Indigenous peoples of the Northwest by joining their efforts to work for social justice and to care for this land. It is my honor to introduce our guests this evening. Misha Burson is a freelance writer, author, and teacher. For 25 years, she was the theater critic at the Seattle Times, where she also wrote on occasion about books, travel, film, and music. Her books include Something's Coming, Something Good, West Side Story, and The American Imagination. She has taught courses at University of Washington and Seattle University, and currently is an instructor in the University of Washington's Osher Lifelong Learning Program. Terry Repak worked as a reporter for several years before going to graduate school at the London School of Economics and Political Science and earning a PhD at Emory University. She and her partner lived in East and West Africa and in Europe, where he directed AIDS projects and she wrote and raised their children. She has published 2 other nonfiction books, numerous travel articles for newspapers and magazines, and her research in academic journals. She lives here in Seattle, where she continues to write and to teach English to foreign language learners and to garden, hike, and swim. Just right before we get started, I want to point out 2 things. First of all, in the back there, when it's time to move on to the post-talk signing part of the evening, check out pictures from Terry's many travels circumnavigating the globe, as well as refreshments. And for those who would like to take home a copy of Circling Home, which I cannot recommend highly enough, we have copies over at the cash register, which is right that away. And without further ado, enjoy the discussion, and thank you for being here tonight.
So, because I know there are people here from the U District, I have to say how I met Terry. We met at a benefit for our wonderful university food bank, and I was sitting at a table that a neighbor had bought the whole table, invited everybody to on our block to come. And there was this person sitting next to me who was amazingly friendly, no Seattle freeze at all. And the minute I started talking to her, I thought, wow, what a fascinating person. So I'm very lucky to have her now as a friend, and she's about, a 2-minute walk from my house. So, so we do a lot of borrowing and trading and that kind of thing. But it's been my great privilege and pleasure to learn more through just being with Terry and also this beautiful book, and being with Stefan about the truly adventurous and fascinating lives that they have lived. We'll get into that now, and the book goes into quite a bit of personal detail. I just wanted to ask you first, Terry, when did you start getting the bug that you were really interested in other countries and living in other countries? Was that early on in your life, or was that when you went to school abroad?
I think it was really early on. Can everybody hear me? Yeah.
Go closer.
Put it closer.
Yeah.
I'm one of 7 kids, and I had a lot of responsibility in my family growing up, and so I felt like the only way to get free of that was to go far away. So I went to Ohio for college first, to Ohio Wesleyan, and while there, learned about a studies abroad program in Austria, in Salzburg, Austria. So I went there to study German, and that just kind of was the tip of the iceberg. I had a Eurail pass, traveled all over Europe, and said, I've got to live overseas someday. So that's when I, a couple of years later, applied for graduate school in London, lived there for a year and a half, fell in love with it, thought, oh my God, I really want to live here someday. and did everything I could to do that, but it didn't work out. I bounced back and forth for about 6 times. I went to London trying to find work and trying to find something to do. It didn't work. Then, good thing it didn't, because I met Stefan shortly after I returned from London, and he wanted to live overseas, so I said, maybe this is my ticket.
Yep, so you had a feeling of what it was like to live in a different culture, even, as a young person. At what point, if Stefan is an epidemiologist, and I think he was still studying when you met him, or is that true?
He was a resident.
He was a resident. At what point did you decide, it's important for you, both for professional and personal reasons, to go live outside of the country?
I can't say that was my decision, because Stefan was really determined. He was training in epidemiology. We lived in Santa Fe while he was doing his epi training, and he was determined to go overseas. I was determined to have a young family. So we had first one child, and then another, and Stefan said, there's this great position open in Ivory Coast, I'd like to try it. And I was really hesitant. It was 1993, the height of the AIDS epidemic in Africa. It seemed really risky to take 2 little kids there, a 1 and a 3-year-old. But I said, yes, we'll go for 2 years, because that's how long his contract would be. And dragged my feet, was very nervous and full of anxiety when I went, because AIDS and malaria were the leading causes of death then. And I think it was a couple of months before I really found my footing. And part of that was due to reaching out to women and expats who were in the same position I was. And I met pretty much within a couple of months Carol Squire, who's here tonight. So she's a friend for 30 years. And women like Carol, I met a number of really amazing women who were doing incredible work in African countries, in Ivory Coast. Carol was very early to realize how important social marketing was for teaching people about AIDS, because there was a stigma about finding out whether you were positive for the virus, telling your family. And so Carol very early on started her own company to teach people about AIDS. Eventually there was a soap opera. There were all kinds of things that really did help to break down that stigma. So that was a long-winded answer for
Fine. So you did find your footing, but I know at the beginning it was a culture shock for you for a number of reasons. And you were also fearful, as many people might be, given the situation with these epidemics. There's a early passage in your book that maybe you could look at, the one where you're in Senegal, and maybe just share with us that passage, because I think one can relate to it, that was your introduction, and it wasn't real comfortable at first.
That was actually, so the Senegal trip was actually several years into our stay in Ivory Coast. And by then, I was pretty well accustomed to speaking French, it was a French-speaking country we were living in. The children were speaking French by then, within 2 years or so. I was afraid the first year or so, because you worry about your kids coming down with illnesses, safety. We were warned in the beginning. We had a guard at our house. All Americans attached to the U.S. Embassy had to have a guard 24/7. And we had a lovely man, older man from Burkina Faso, who really helped me with my French. I learned a lot just talking to him every day when he would greet us. The kids loved him. He would carry them around, or play with squirt guns with them. And his name was Adama. And he developed AIDS after our first year there. And so it was really hard watching him get sicker and sicker and thinner. And he eventually died. Carol and I marched together in the first World AIDS Day, or the second one, shortly after that. But the part about Senegal, I think partly because of friendships that I made and joining groups like Professional Women's Network and whatever I could plunge into, I wanted to make connections with people. And once I did that, I got my footing. So that's what made me sort of feel like I was at home. It took a while, but if if you want me to read the Senegal part, because by the time we got to Senegal, I really felt like we were all pretty much at home in Ivory Coast. So this is a trip we took with our kids for Easter break. 2 months after my trip to Nigeria, Stefan took a week off at Easter and we flew to Senegal with our children. We spent a few days in the capital, Dakar, which we found to be cleaner and safer than Abidjan and with a more temperate climate, before hiring a taxi to take us to a beach town on the coast. The drive through the dusty countryside took much longer than expected, since we were held up multiple times by herds of goats spilling onto the road. Ahmed, the taxi driver, told us it was the Feast of Tabaski, a Muslim version of our Thanksgiving, and that most of the goats and lambs would be slaughtered that day. After describing the Tabaski rituals as he drove, he spontaneously invited us to his family's feast and said he lived near the beach where we were going. We accepted his offer with some trepidation, since we didn't know what Ahmed's family would think of 4 white foreigners crashing their holiday. When we arrived at his home, a modest bungalow with a dirt courtyard surrounded by high walls, a bleeding goat was tethered in the yard, and Ahmed's brother and family were there waiting. Because the weather was hot and we thought we were going to the beach, Stefan and I were dressed in t-shirts and shorts, while our hosts were wearing long robes. I felt out of place at first, yet the family's warmth and friendly faces reassured me. Ahmed sent one of his sons to buy soft drinks for everyone, and we stood around sipping Orangina as we watched him prepare to kill the goat. Ahmed dug a hole in the ground and sharpened an old butcher knife before pinning the goat down with its neck positioned over the hole. Quickly and efficiently, he sliced the goat's throat and let the blood drain into the ground. When he began to disembowel it, I watched Aaron and Elena anxiously to see if the slaughter might bother them. On the contrary, they watched in fascination at what turned out to be an anatomy lesson, as Stefan identified the body parts when Ahmed removed the intestines, kidneys, liver, and heart. While hunks of meat were roasting, Stefan spoke with the man in French, and I watched the women tend the fire and roast the victuals. When they were ready, we sat on low wooden stools and ate our fill of rice and goat meat, as the children ran off to play with Ahmed's kids and other village children. We didn't see much of them in the ensuing hour, and I couldn't help worrying as they ran around the village with Ahmed's children. Aaron and Elena had so much fun playing with the kids that they didn't want to leave when it was time to go to our hotel. I wasn't alone in remembering that day as a singular experience. Years later, I would ask Aaron if he had mostly good memories of growing up overseas, and he'd tell me that his strongest memories of childhood revolved around play. he would cite that trip to Senegal as an example of how he could play with kids he'd never met before who didn't speak his language, though they did communicate in French. Few children in the US grew up playing games with foreigners and interacting with adults from other countries the way our kids did. As a result, they were flexible enough to adapt and feel at home almost anywhere.
Sorry, I got my excerpts mixed up there. That was a really positive one.
That wasn't positive.
I remember that in some places in the book, you're very candid about the fact that you had servants, and that was not something, that most American families that don't have a whole lot of money have. And that those relationships were very interesting to you. You had to, kind of feel your way. Can you talk about that a little bit? You mentioned your friend who became so close to the children and perished from AIDS, but there were quite a few other people who you became close to. And how did you navigate that sense of privilege that you had as an American?
Yeah, that was hard. We never ever called them servants or thought of them that way because it was kind of like the relationship you have with someone who comes to clean your house here. They're employees. And so we had, and most households of expats would have somebody come and clean your house at least once a week. Some people had dinners. Stefan had a representational post and we had to have big dinners frequently. I think our biggest one was 40 people one day we had to have in our yard. So you needed help. You didn't have dishwashers. When you bought vegetables like fresh spinach and lettuce and things like that, somebody had to wash that in a bleach and water bath to kill parasites and things. So it was more labor intensive to work in the kitchen. So we had a man cooking for us 2 or 3 days a week. And we had a woman who came 2 or 3 days a week to do housekeeping. She sometimes watched the kids. Her name was Gladys. Became very close to the kids and to us. I'm still in touch with Gladys Busman, the guard who took over when Adama died. And I'm still in touch with them through email today. So they're long-term relationships. But the cook that we had, who was a very quiet, sweet man from Burkina Faso, like Adama, our first guard, he had 7 children in Burkina and 2 wives because he was Muslim like Adama was. And he too, in our last year, started getting sicker and sicker and very thin. And we suggested that he get tested for AIDS. He didn't mind doing that because he trusted Stefan and wanted to have counseling and that type of thing. And it was really heartbreaking in our last year because we knew we were leaving and we knew he was dying. There was nothing that anybody could do for him. And shortly after we left in 1999 after 6 years. And shortly after we left, he did die, and so did his young wife and baby. So it was really a terrible thing to watch when we were there in the 90s, and a very different story when we went back in the 2000s. Do you want me to segue into that? Yes.
Well, no, I want to ask you a couple of other questions.
Okay.
You became very interested, speaking of polygamy, in people who had intermarriages with Ivorians, and you actually did some kind of a study of that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because one of the things that came up when you were asking people how they felt and what their marriage was like was the fact that polygamy was very common.
Right. That was after, so when we moved to Ivory Coast, I was finishing a book from my PhD. So that was, that kept me busy for a year when we first moved there. And that book was a book on immigration, Central American immigrants to the nation's capital. I was looking for another writing project after I finished that one. And Carol was partly the inspiration for that too, because Carol was a Peace Corps volunteer when she first went to Ivory Coast, 1980, and married an Ivorian man and completely adapted to the culture there. He was Muslim and she would celebrate the Muslim holidays with him, but her Christian holidays as well. Had 2 children. Carol had a great network of women friends. And so through her, I met eventually 24 women who I interviewed about choosing to live in Ivory Coast and leaving your home country and what that was like. So, yes, one of the interesting things that came up was the question of sexual exclusivity. Dr. Bob Howard. And it came up because several of the women I interviewed had husbands who had another wife. And I found that so fascinating to ask them why. One was an African American woman, one was a white woman from Syracuse. And they were both incredibly tolerant of other people's beliefs, rituals, traditions, and they made it work.
Mm-hmm. Well, one wonders how, but did you publish this study? Or did you? What happened to that study?
So it kind of got incorporated into this book. So there's a chapter where I talk a lot about those customs and these women who, several of them, a handful of them became good friends. And that was kind of the impetus too for doing this, all these interviews, was I just found their lives fascinating. I wanted to know how they adapted to another culture so seamlessly. And so they became friends, and it really helped me to find my place there, to listen to them. There was no internet back then, believe it or not. We didn't even have cell phones, so it was hard to call home. But so I sent the article that I tried to write about it, I sent it back to several magazines, newspapers in the US, and it would take 2 weeks to get there and 2 weeks to get a response if they responded right away. So it did not get published. But as I say, I've incorporated it, and I had a lot of thoughts and ideas to use for other stories.
So you were talking about then you returned, right? And this is another question I wanted to ask you, because this whole theme of living abroad and really immersing yourself in another culture. You were there for a year or 6 months. A lot of AIDS workers, general AIDS, AI, small ideas, go for a very limited amount of time. You had things occur with your families. You had, some severe illnesses in your families. You had concerns about your siblings and so on. How did you handle that, since you're both very family-oriented people?
I would say, when we talk about the challenges and the benefits of raising kids overseas, living overseas, one of the real challenges was being far from the family. And my father had several mini strokes, TIAs, while I was overseas. Stefan's mother had a number of problems. So we were back and forth a lot, but from Africa it was much harder with kids, so I tried not to do it more than twice a year. And it was one of the reasons why, so we moved back to Atlanta in 2000 and stayed there for 5-6 years. It was just as hard for the kids to adjust to life in Atlanta as it was to life in an African country, because they weren't used to, the way American kids play or what music they listen to and that type of thing. But they eventually adapted. They were never typical Americans, I don't think, in those years.
What do you mean by that?
I don't think they were ever, well, maybe, maybe that is a hard thing. I'm not gonna go there, it's too hard to describe it, but I don't think they felt at home in the US for years. I think it took a long time. And then, so I'll segue to Tanzania. So Stefan, or not
I just want to ask, so you moved back to Atlanta, and is that when Stefan was he working for the CDC?
oh, he worked for the CDC the whole time.
But he went back to work
Yes.
at the sort of
CDC
headquarters,
yes.
okay.
And then after 5 years in the US, Stefan came home one day and said, what would you think about moving to Tanzania? And I was like, gulp. And our daughter, Helena, was 12 or 13 at the time. And she just yelled, do it, Dad. So, she was, teenagers like to reinvent themselves, and she really wanted to move overseas and live in a bigger house again and not have to clean her own. So, but the second time around, when it came to that move, I pretty much jumped in with both feet. I said, yeah, we'll go. I didn't know how long it would last, but Tanzania sounded fascinating, much safer than Ivory Coast. Stable, a very stable country in Africa, has never had a coup or anything like that. So when the kids finally came around, my son, but the daughter was eager to go. Our son dragged his feet a little bit. He was in 9th grade going into 10th, hard to leave in high school. And he just, this is one of the benefits of living overseas for kids, is that they develop a different perspective. They look on their own lives, but other people in the world from different eyes than typical American, if you'll forgive me.
I agree.
And so the kids, having had such an interesting and really warm upbringing, because people, were always so kind to them when they were growing up in Ivory Coast, they were ready to do it. Adam, my son, said that he'd be sad to leave his friends in high school, but he said, I'm gonna have to leave them anyway in 3 years to go to college, so why not have some adventures first?
That was a pretty mature attitude, I think. Yeah. So you went to Tanzania, and you went to Tanzania, and tell us a little bit about the difference in, you were saying it was a safer country, it wasn't war torn. What was your experience like there that was different than, because I think one of the things you've said a lot to me is that Americans have this idea of Africa as one place, one big country, and mostly just our ignorance, since, not a lot of us have traveled there extensively. So I take it was an extremely different place, right?
Totally different. It was, Ivory Coast is sort of a tropical West African country with a very long cultural traditions and just wonderful mass traditions, dance, music. Everybody knows West African music. Or Congolese music. It's very infectious. East Africa had not such long historical roots because the people were more pastoral and nomadic historically. But it's also just so different in the countryside. It's much more arid. Dar es Salaam is right on the coast of the Indian Ocean. And we lived a block away from the ocean and the beach. And being big swimmers, that was like moving to paradise. I think for all of us, it was a really easy adjustment. And it was a much more upbeat time moving there. The AIDS scene had totally transformed. There was antiretroviral medication now that was made AIDS no longer a death sentence. So the work of CDC directors and anybody that was doing any work, health workers in Africa, was to get as many HIV infected people on medication as possible. They wouldn't transmit AIDS as easily that way, and they didn't have to die. They could live normal lives. So it was a much happier time. It was a much more positive focus to Stefan's work. The kids, after just a couple of months, the international schools in other countries are wonderful. I mean, they're great. The standards are very high. The student body changes a lot because people come and go so much, so there aren't as many cliques. Kids adjusted seamlessly. And they started doing incredible excursions with their school group. Our son climbed Kilimanjaro with the school group. Our daughter got her diving license in Zanzibar. For community service, they could do all kinds of fascinating projects. So they really they saw beautiful landscapes and had wonderful opportunities, but they also still they were immersed in poverty and, the fact that their father was working with people who could die if they didn't get on medication. So they did see both sides. We saw both sides.
You mentioned Kilimanjaro, and one of my favorite parts of the book was this trip you took to Kilimanjaro with a group of women. And it's interesting because you talk about, what it was like to climb that fabled mountain, but also just how your perceptions of the women changed as you were making this epic trek. Can you talk a little bit about that trip and what it meant to you?
Sure. We were 8 very different women, different ages, from different places. There was a Finnish woman who was in her 30s, late 30s, and we were in our 50s, my friend and I, who organized the trek. Because friendships are so important to me, it's really how I find my base and sense of home when I moved to other countries. I really wanted all these women to get along. And I wanted all of us, and when you're hiking together for 7 days, sleeping in tents and, encouraging each other as we're walking and that kind of thing, you find some really close bonds, but you also find some irritations about each other. And there were a couple of people that had some conflicts and irritations in the group. And this became particularly critical when we were summiting. So the last day, when you have to get up at midnight and start walking, and you're really doing the hardest part of the climb. You're at 16,000 feet. There's very little air up there. We weren't doing oxygen or anything. So that's when some of the, one of the conflicts in particular became critical. And I'm not going to tell what happened because you haven't.
It's one of the juiciest stories.
Yeah. But we did end up, really, nobody fought and it was fine. And I've kept up with all of them. So.
Another story that, I don't want to spoil it, but I found it fascinating was when you met a American ambassador and your perceptions of him. I think one of the things that's great about the book on a personal level is you talk very openly and honestly about how sometimes you misjudge a situation and gradually, are willing to sort of change your attitude. But this adventure I found very fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about that? You don't have to spoil the whole thing.
No. So I signed up for an embassy trip. The embassy was always organizing really interesting trips to different places. And I signed up for a trip to Madagascar. And it was a week-long trip. And there were 3 couples and me. So I thought that we were going to be 7 and get to the airport and find out that the US ambassador to Tanzania was going along.
And what administration was this? It's
Yes.
important.
Well, yeah, he was an appointee of George W. Bush and was a big name dropper. And he was really very wealthy, owned a number of restaurants, and so was always telling stories. And one of these handsome, dapper guys who was twice divorced and dating, these chic women from the Belgian and the Italian embassies. And so I didn't think I'd have anything to say to this guy. He was really, constantly talking about, yes, my friend Karl Rove and this and that. I'm like, but over the course of the week, he really he revealed himself little by little. We all did, because you get grungy sometimes. You're hiking. We were looking for lemurs and chameleons. That's what you do in Madagascar. Beautiful at the time. And so we're trekking and looking for these lemurs, and he would start talking about when he was a boy growing up in the mountains in the Ozarks, I think, in Arkansas, and how he wandered these mountains all by himself because his father was a military man and always away. It makes you see the human side of people. And, he really won my heart when we were coming back from one of our treks and we passed through a village, and there were, outside of one person's shack, there were a bunch of turkeys. And he went by we're all walking by, and he goes by and goes, oh, and the turkeys popped up their heads and gobbled back at him. He knew exactly how to talk to these turkeys. I like that.
The Ozarks, yeah. Well, you neglected the part where he flirted kind of outrageously with you, but we'll read that.
My husband's here.
You read the book too, right? So, we've talked a little bit about your kids, and I know the book, I know you wrestle a little bit with how much do I, speak for my kids or reveal about my kids' experience. And I think that would probably be true for any loving mother who is writing this kind of memoir. And one of the things that happened that I thought was so interesting after you had all been kind of on the same page about moving and when you moved was that your daughter really wanted to stay in Africa at a certain point when you all wanted to go home. And I wondered how, why you think that happened. I mean, I know she had a boyfriend, she was very interested in him, but it seems to me that was such an interesting turnabout, that she was not clamoring to get back to America. How, can you talk a little bit about that and, without making her bad? I mean, she was a teenager who
She was
had
a difficult one. She probably
own
agreed.
mind.
Yeah.
But how did you cope with that kind of situation? Because that's kind of, you always think maybe the kids are trying to get home. And in this case, you had decided to get home.
Yeah, that was a tough one. She was very attached to a boyfriend in Dar es Salaam. They were 10th graders. She would have been going into 11th grade. That's a really tough time to leave any high school. And she wasn't excited about going back to Atlanta. She had been excited about leaving Atlanta. I don't think she really fit into high school in Atlanta when she was there, or junior high. She knew where she'd be going back to, and that, it was a cliquey school. We thought it was really good for her to go back and to go to that school because it had a really strong musical theater program. They won all kinds of awards. And she has an amazing voice. She's really, I mean, it's not just a mother speaking, she's the bomb. So we really thought she had great opportunities coming back to this program. And in fact, Mom was right because the year after we got back, she won the Georgia-wide award for Best Supporting Actress for a play that she was in. So, but it was very hard for her, and I won't diminish the fact that she suffered probably more than anybody else with that move. But my father was growing very frail, and we really wanted to get back. Stefan's mother was dying. It was time to come back, even though all of us hated to leave. I didn't want to leave. Stefan didn't want to leave. Tanzania is an amazing place, and it was hard for everybody, but it was hardest on her. Our son, not so much, because he was going off to college, so he didn't mind.
So you had a lot, and I know people have asked you about how do you do these things and, you know, be a good mom and take care of your kids. And it seems like there's a lot of weighing and balancing that went on
There
in
is.
your experience.
And you don't know how much you're going to be blamed for later. I mean,
You don't have to go anywhere to be blamed.
right, that's true. Daughters especially like to blame, but there's a stereotype, so I shouldn't say that.
Well, and it's interesting that she is now living in London with
And she's living my dream.
with her fiance and grandchildren. So let me just ask one last question, and then we can open it up to other people. So you came back and you have settled in Seattle, where your son Adam lives, and if you want to talk about Switzerland, that's fine. Would you like to?
Well, I'll just mention briefly. So when we came back from Tanzania, we were in Atlanta again for 4 years. And Stefan once again came home one day and said, "What would you think about moving to Switzerland?" And I said, "Are you going to quit CDC?" And he said, "No, I would be seconded there." So they would send him to work on hepatitis and AIDS. And so, you know, here we were in our 50s, and I knew that if the kids had left home, so the kids weren't a factor by then. And I knew that this would probably be his last post overseas. I wouldn't move twice. So I said yes to Switzerland. And, you know, as easy and idyllic as it might sound, it was the hardest place for me to adjust. So I did not find the groups that I did in African countries or the warmth of the people that live there, the local people. The Swiss are hard. You know, I mean, I don't mean to say that as a blanket rule. We were in this French-speaking part of Switzerland. Geneva was a very hard place to meet people because a lot of them are foreigners and they're there for business. So they go to their offices and they're doing business. And so I found it much harder to kind of find my feet on the ground. Plus, my father had just passed away, as had Stefan's mother. And I had a sister who was in trouble. And so I was back and forth for her. And our daughter was having problems in the US. She wasn't very happy. So there were lots of reasons why we were back and forth. But yes, settling in Seattle.
Yeah, okay. Well, isn't that interesting that, you know, Africa, which sounds to many of us, especially in the middle of an AIDS epidemic, like could be such a challenge and struggle, but then you go to spick and span Switzerland, wealthy, one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
And scenic.
And scenic, even scenic. Well, so you're back here whenever you got back here, and do you miss not being in a foreign culture? How was it for the two of you to, you know, say, okay, we're we're Americans again, and we're living in an American city. And I know there's some wonderful people here who also are, who you knew in Africa and other places who work with the CDC. So you're not without, your old connections. But it was that difficult to just settle back into a more American routine.
No, not at all. No, once I got here, I really wanted to live in Seattle because my best friend from college is here. And we celebrated 51 years of friendship recently. I just loved coming here to visit her and her husband, and love the Pacific Northwest, love the mountains. I was so excited about moving here and so done with travel that I knew, travel's always going to be in our future, but I really wanted to plant myself here and not move around so much. And I'm sad that my daughter lives so far away. She's in London. She has 2 babies now, and I don't get to see them very often. But I'm really happy to be here. This will be our home base and our springboard. I circled it for so long, and I found home, and I'm staying.
Well, I'm happy about that. So does anybody want to make a comment or ask a question about book or Terry's extremely adventurous life? Anyone? Yes.
So why is this? Why is Seattle home?
Oh,
It seemed like
Could you repeat it, because there was a background?
you did not grow up here, so how did Seattle become the place that you would want to call home?
Did everyone hear
It's a
that?
place that seemed to happen much later.
Good question. I did come here about a dozen times to visit this old friend, or I should say long-term friend. And it really resonated with me. They're big hikers and great cooks. And we'd go hiking every time I came out here camping. Something really resonated with me out here. I loved seeing all the water around, the mountains. In Atlanta, there are mountains not far away. The Appalachians run all the way down to North Georgia. It's just not the same. They're to my eye now, they're like hills compared to what's out here. Something resonated. I felt at home here. I met people right away. I'd say half the people I met are from back east who also relocated and didn't want to go back there. But I'm happy that, the same is true for, I think, you, Carol. She lived all over the world. She was in Abidjan with us, and then in the Indian subcontinent for 10, 15 years. And Carol gravitated out here too, and she's very much at home here. She's on Whidbey Island. Was that enough of an answer?
Yeah, we have a big international community here now. That wasn't always so in Seattle, but since the tech industry.
Well, and global health.
Yeah, and global health.
It's really
yes.
expanded a lot thanks to UW, their global health department, and the Gates Foundation and all that. So yeah, a lot more people are migrating out here. Other good friends from CDC. So
Anyone else have a question or a comment? Yes.
I was curious when my voice carries. During your stints in Africa, were you involved with distribution of medicine, interacting with people, trying with?
my husband did that. You can ask him questions too. If anybody has AIDS questions, he's here for free. I felt like my job was to witness. And I was a journalist. I trained as a journalist. I wrote just copiously in my journals. And I just didn't let anything go past me about the people that live there, about their lives, and about what we were, what was happening in the AIDS world. So I went on home health visits with people from the CDC staff and would go to these houses where people were, girls were out of school because they were taking care of their mothers who were dying of AIDS. And I wrote about that. And then, so when we were in Tanzania, I was asked to do a column for a monthly magazine there. And I wrote a lot about AIDS and about the various organizations and the groups that were doing really good work there. So, but by that time, yes, the job of anybody that was working in the AIDS world was to get as many people as possible on medication. So they were still doing a lot of testing, but treatment was a really important facet of the work then. So did that answer your question, or is there
Yes,
anything
I
more
was
to
just
that?
sort of curious and whether, witness the transformation in the culture. Was there resistance to your,
I think people.
was it a COVID?
I mean, it was like the Holocaust in Africa. The epidemic was so bad. Everybody had people who were dying of AIDS in the 90s and into the 2000s, so that, the US did this wonderful thing under President George W. Bush, gotta give him credit. He started was the impetus for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. And that program just celebrated its 20th anniversary, has given maybe upwards of close to $100 billion of our taxpayer money to fund AIDS treatment all around the world. And people were happy to line up and get the medication. They wanted it. I mean, you didn't have to die anymore. And now there's a new pill called PrEP.
Right, I see the ads for that here.
Yeah. And so anybody who's in a high-risk population can now get PrEP to keep from getting AIDS, so that they won't even get the virus.
Anyone else have a question or a comment?
Don't really have a question, it's just that PEPFAR is in jeopardy.
Right,
Yeah.
thank you for making that point.
Yeah, are there things that we can do to support it?
It's being held up in the House for reauthorization. And there have been, I think Heritage Foundation or some of the conservative think tanks have put out the false news that PEPFAR funds abortions in third world countries. And it's just not the case. They have I know the CDC programs in particular, any funding that's coming to them, they have to verify that there is no funding for abortions in their countries. So it is something that's being held up. Yes, you could tell your Congress people to push for reauthorization. If it's not reauthorized, it's going to go to a year-by-year basis and it'll be kind of picked apart. So thank you for asking that question. That's important.
Anything else? Oh,
Really the whole book is about what you've learned about living overseas and from living overseas. But I wonder if you could distill it in perhaps a piece of advice that you might give to somebody who's going to live abroad in a third world country, be it Africa, or India, Indonesia, wherever. What would be one or two things you'd say are the most important things to know or an attitude to bring?
I think you're absolutely right. We all have, and I had stereotypes about Africa, and my fears grew out of that when I was moving over there. And there's a Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie, she's written a book called Americana, which is really great. But she did a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. And it's about talking about Africa as a monolithic entity. You know, it's like talking about Latin America as one country. It's so many different countries, so many different cultures, such different histories, and different people that there's just so much beauty in each country. And it's so different. We traveled all over. I think we went to at least half of the African countries, other African countries while we were there. And each one was just astounding in its own way, different. But so my advice, if I were to talk to somebody who's moving overseas, foreign service people and CDC people do it all the time, every year, is to just go with your mind open and read as much as you can, learn as much of the local language as you can. We learned some Swahili while we were in Tanzania. And just join everything you can. Like if there's a local women's group, join the local women. If they could use tutors. I tutored at a little elementary school that was in another neighborhood, not close to ours. And I was tutoring little kids. I saw so much of what family life was like in Tanzania through these little kids that would come. So yeah, I would say leave your stereotypes and fixed ideas behind, and your fears and your worries, and just go and seize opportunities. Go, travel as much as you can, learn as much as you can, meet as many people as you can, because it's really in forming connections that you feel, like you can belong in a place, even for a couple of years.
Well, that's a good place to end. Milo, do you want to explain about book signing?
Can I just briefly
Yeah.
thank Milo? Thank you so much. She was like so enthusiastic. And thank you all for coming. I mean, half of you are my neighbors and friends. I love you. Thank you, Misha, of course. She's my dear friend. And, and I wanted to just say, please support your independent bookstore. This is an independent bookstore. So even if you don't buy my book, buy something from them one of these days. And I put a bunch of pictures up for you all to see while we're milling around. Cookies are there. These are pictures from our earliest days, Abidjan in the 90s, because by the time we went to Tanzania, everything was digital, so we didn't take pictures. So now, did you want to say?
Milo, do you want to say, are you going to have books for sale somewhere in the vicinity here?
Yes, books will be for sale at the cashier booth right there. They're all hanging out back there, so if you'd like one, just head on over. If you would like a book signed, we can kind of line up. I'm gonna have Karen, it's gonna be just kind of hang out with people. Pretty good signing location. We're just gonna line up right down this way and up to the table, get some refreshments, and thank you so much for coming.